Hello and welcome to Newsmakers for this Tuesday, December 17th, 2024. I'm Louie Butko, and on today's show, we're taking a little bit of a look back at some of the biggest Canadian media stories of the past year while looking ahead to 2025. And to do that, I'm pleased to welcome on the show editor of MediaPolicy.ca. He's also the author of the book Canada versus California, How Ottawa Took on Netflix and the Streaming Giants, which maps out the ongoing battle to create and promote Canadian content and the digital revolution that has made it less visible than ever. It's available now at Indigo and on Amazon, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Howard Law. Howard, thank you so much for making the time here today. Let's talk about that book of yours. It seems like it's a tall task, Canada versus California. First of all, what's the book about, and what do you see happening in this battle that's continuing to be fought?
Well, it's a long battle that's been fought for decades, and it's become even more challenging for fans of Canadian content and local news since the advent of the internet. And so Bill C-11, the Netflix bill, and all the parliamentary drama around that, and all the myths and all the facts around that, is about making sure that there's still some shelf space for local content, for Canadian content, in what otherwise is an American-dominated continental market for media. And so for those of you who heard a little bit of noise coming out of Ottawa for a couple of years on the Netflix bill, the book tries to explain what happened, what is this really about, what is just noise. And it's only $28, which makes just a perfect seasonal gift.
You mentioned Bill C-18, of course. Bill C-11 as well. The effects of that still being felt. I believe this is the first full year in which we've gone in which Facebook, Meta, Instagram has not allowed outlets to post their news in an effort to try and get it out of paying this fee to the news that provides it. For a refresher, Bill C-18 obviously is now in effect. How has it been felt in 2024? What are people missing out on, obviously, because of this bill and its effects?
Well, they're not missing out on Google. Google had threatened to also do a news block, but in the end they didn't. And it was just a matter of negotiating a price that they could live with and the Canadian government could live with, which is $100 million a year going to Canadian news outlets for the news content they put up on Google, where people search for it. On the Meta side, Meta has had second thoughts about paying for news, which they agreed to do in Europe and they agreed to do in Australia. And now they've done pretty much a 180 on that. And in order to evade the Canadian legislation, which followed after Australia and Europe, they've blocked news on Facebook and Instagram. They haven't blocked it entirely. You can still find some news, either because people are taking screenshots or because Meta is letting it through because they're splitting some hairs over what is news and what is not. So the last chapter hasn't been written on that, but of course we may be after the next federal election, we may be into an entirely new book rather than the next chapter.
To that point, you're talking about the chapters still being written. Just a week ago, this past week, Meta is finally basically CRTC said you need to show us how people are getting around this. They fought that and said no, we don't need to tell you that. We don't need to make that public. This Meta CRTC battle, Canadian government, you just teased something a little bit there. If there's a change in government, but with this current government, would you call it a frosty relationship? Is it a unhealthy relationship between a tech giant like Meta and the Canadian government and the Canadian public, I guess?
Well, I think Meta has a frosty relationship with almost every government in the world except for Donald Trump now. It appears that they're sucking up to Trump, as other big tech companies are as well, because they're scared. But in terms of the relationship with the Canadian government, the Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg started saying to Canada a couple of years ago, we just won't pay. And their only way of getting out of paying was to block news and therefore say that they didn't have anything to pay for. And, a lot of people have felt that given that social media platforms are the second most likely source of news for Canadians after television, that was a big deal in terms of people's access to news. Now, there are all lots of other ways to get news, thankfully, for now. But I think that the bad blood between Meta and the government or many other governments in the world is not going to change quickly.
What are some of the consequences of people maybe thinking they're getting news from Facebook or Meta? Maybe that, like you said, maybe that's their main source of information. But when, articles from established news organizations like CHCH or CTV that go through rigorous vetting processes. There's legal consequences to what we say and what we put out there on the air as a news organization. What are the consequences to Canadian consumers using Facebook and Meta if they're not getting these peer-reviewed, legal vetted stories on their platforms?
Well, you know what that is. It's fake news or the danger of fake news or misinformation or just grossly biased news. The advantage of what professional news journalism has to offer is the discipline of journalism and the presentation of facts free of bias as possible as that is in any human endeavor. The social media platforms are owned by a variety of mostly American, also Chinese owners, and they are essentially advertising companies. That's how they make their money, by ad revenue that's generated by content. They're not especially picky, nor about content, nor do they adhere to any kind of journalistic standards. So that's not their fault. That's their business. But as long as they're letting through some pretty questionable content masquerading as news, it's all the more important, and especially in a country like Canada, which is a small country, that professional journalism survives and thrives.
Howard, we are very likely heading towards a provincial election here in Ontario, a federal election coast to coast, and media literacy seems to be a bit of an issue right now. And because of things like fake news on Facebook or YouTube algorithms that continue to pump out very specific videos that they think you're going to like, how can we be more media literate in 2025? What are some things that we can look for when it comes to election news to make sure we're getting as unbiased as it comes information and well-informed information?
Well, I think for adults, people who are already voters, I think it's very important for people to look for the branding of the news source. What news outlet is putting this out? Do you trust them? Do they have a track record that deserves that trust? That's really important. But media literacy is also a sort of long-term project. Now we know that young people, by which I'm saying the teens and 20-somethings, turn to TikTok for a lot of content, including news. And so it's important to educate young people, and even younger than young people, the kids, about what journalism is and basically media literacy. Canada no Canadian government has really taken media literacy very seriously. I noticed that the Australians now are making a big push on funding media literacy. We have 13 different jurisdictions in Canada, including, of course, the provinces who are responsible for education. And I think one of the more important issues that we don't pay enough attention to is a national program of digital literacy.
You mentioned the Australias, and even as recently, I believe it was last week, a few weeks ago, instituting a ban on social media for all users under the age of 16. And again, working with social media companies to make sure that ban can be enforced, moving forward. You mentioned TikTok. That's something that's been in the headlines a lot in the past year. And again, even this week, the Supreme Court in the U.S. is talking about TikTok. In Canada, the Supreme Court getting involved, TikTok issuing a challenge. How do you see TikTok being a headline in 2025? Where does that go with all these governments try to fight for its ownership and the distrust of the Chinese company ByteDance?
Yeah, I don't know. Everything that's going to happen is going to happen south of the border. We're going to end up doing whatever the Americans do. I think that's likely, and not necessarily a bad thing, although I'd like to see what they're going to do first. I don't think that this ban goes into effect. This ban was on TikTok, not only the company, but their app is in the United States. We haven't banned the app, not yet. The U.S. Supreme Court has not heard the decision, the appeal from the Circuit Court of Appeal, which upheld the congressional ban, which goes into effect on January 19th, the day before Trump gets elected. Trump, has been all over the map on TikTok, and so it makes for a fairly unpredictable future for that app and that ban. And of course, everybody's operating in the dark about how serious are the national security concerns that both the Americans and the Canadians and other countries are citing about the Chinese-owned TikTok, which is owned by ByteDance, which is a Chinese company.
Mm-hmm. It'll be interesting to see that play out. Let's go back. Let's look back on 2024. Just sort of generally speaking, some of the things that stood out to me from a media perspective, having been in the business for about a decade now. Some things catch my attention, like Corus. Corus has continued to struggle this year. They keep layoffs keep happening. They're not immune to it, of course, just them. But where do you see them this past year? How do they get out of where they are right now, which is a pretty tough time right now?
Well, Corus's situation has been deteriorating for a long time, for several years, and actually they've looked for a buyer or a major equity investor for some time now, as their situation gets worse. Last year, I think they lost about $150 million. Corus, of course, owns not only entertainment channels, which is where they make their money, because half of their programming is American, and that's what makes them money. And they also own global television, the 15 local news stations, which loses money. It lost about $130 million last year. So it's a bad situation, and it's made worse by the fact that ever since 2016, when they were spun off from Shaw by the Shaw family, they've had a crushing debt. And in order to service the debt, when you have a crushing debt, you pay high interest rates. In order to service that debt, they've had to refinance, which means whatever cash flow they can generate needs to pay the debt. It's just a really discouraging situation for the second biggest English language television network. Sorry, the third largest in the country. So then on the entertainment side, which is where they make their money, they just lost their best American programming to Rogers, which outbid them to get their Warner Brothers Discovery content. So things are looking grim for Corus, it reminds me, unfortunately, a lot of Post Media, which of course is the publisher of the National Post and the Brantford Expositor and the Simcoe Reformer. And the strategy, Post Media is the same situation: crushing debt, declining media market. So what they do every year is they lay people off. They just shrink the company so they can be marginally profitable, so they can pay down some debt. And I don't know what the end game for that is, or for Corus, but it doesn't look good.
So you mentioned it being the third largest English broadcaster. If we look at the two largest, they are billion-dollar corporations with giant conglomerates of profits coming in from different areas of business, and that, of course, being Bell and Rogers. But we know they're not immune to layoffs either. Bell, BCE continued to do what it does when it lays off its staff, like you said, pointing to declining revenues, all this idea. How do you see them moving forward in the new year? Two gigantic companies. We've seen Bell, BCE sell off their share of MLSE. That'll be made official in the coming months. Where do you see these two major companies going in 2025?
Well, I mean, the sale, Bell's sale of their share of the Toronto sports teams to Rogers, being the other co-owner, tells you a lot. So so Bell decided that they didn't need to be a landlord of sports teams anymore. They could be a tenant of the sports rights that they put on TSN. And so in exchange for $4.7 billion that they paid to Rogers, they keep programming rights to the games that they have, but they're a tenant now. They're a price taker from Rogers. And the fact that they did that and then turned around and spent $5 billion buying the biggest internet company in the Pacific Northwest, Ziply, tells you what kind of company they want to be. And it does tell you, at least in the long run, how much they think they're a media company in the long run. And whereas Rogers, of course, the company of the big bet, they have a history of betting on themselves. They are double downing on sports content. So by paying $5 billion for exclusive control of sports rights for all those Toronto sports teams, of course, the NHL contract is coming up for renewal, the NHL broadcasting rights for Canada.
Yeah, that 10-year deal obviously going to have a huge impact on what Rogers wants to do moving forward, no?
Well, yeah, and the thing is that they're going to be competing against Amazon and the other U.S. streamers who are getting very interested in sports programming. Now, I don't know that Amazon and Apple have an appetite for taking the entire Canadian national NHL sports contract away from Rogers, but they might want to bid on some games, and the NHL would love to take advantage of that. They love having multiple bidders for their games. So Rogers, they're betting, they're betting on themselves. They're betting on sports. They're essentially a sports broadcasting company, and now that they swallowed Shaw and they're a bigger company, they might have the heft to pull it off. That's one of the stories we're going to follow in the next year or two.
Should be interesting. Another story we'll be watching moving forward will be, all this talk. Pierre Poilievre yesterday was named the Canadian Press Newsmaker of the Year. Canadian Press wire copy calling him the Prime Minister in waiting. A lot of people would agree with that based on the polling numbers right now. Pierre Poilievre has not been shy about how he feels about Canada's national broadcaster, that being the CBC. If I was working at the CBC right now, how nervous would I be about a Pierre Poilievre prime ministership in 2025?
Well, very, because I think he's serious, and he's serious about shutting down all the English language services in the CBC. And that is, the CBC has probably about 3,000 journalists, 2,000 on the English side. And we probably have about 9,000 journalists in Canada. So right away, you're reducing your news gathering capacity for Canada by about 25%. He's also, it's not just the CBC he's been talking about, he's also been talking about pulling all the government support for private media, particularly print media, text-based journalism. That'll be hundreds of more layoffs, in addition to the hundreds we might get anyway. So, here's a situation where, Canada, with possibly Pierre Poilievre as the tip of the spear, we're going to be headed into this protracted trade war with a president who's essentially an economic terrorist. He's prepared to abrogate the trade deal with 25% tariffs just to get what he wants. And we're going to head into a battle like that with half of our own news journalism speaking to Canadians gone. It'll be like fighting a trade war with one hand behind our back. It's a very concerning scenario.
What supports would you like to see? It doesn't sound like you mentioned, the print journalism, that being the local investments that the local journalism, investment fund that the government has put out there that helps newspapers hire reporters. What would you like to see in 2025 for a healthier, more robust Canadian journalism scene?
Well, I think it's important to keep the programs going that we have. The main program is essentially a per journalist subsidy paid by the government. Has been under fire a lot, but it is the most efficient way of guaranteeing that money that goes to journalism ends up with content on the screen or on your tablet. The other thing that hasn't been explored yet, and the idea is getting traction in the United States where they don't have any of these programs that we have, is to do what is essentially a advertising subsidy. So a subsidy paid by the government to advertisers, or like not a full subsidy, but an incentive to put their ads in local television or local media, because that is where the biggest problem is in terms of the sustainability of Canadian media. We have lots of coverage of national news, and hopefully we always will, but it's kind of the Alamo of the news journalism industry that is covering Ottawa. What we really have to worry about is the declining news capacity to cover what's going on provincially, regionally, locally in the community. And because when we lose that kind of journalism, and we've been losing that we've been tracking the closing of news outlets now for 15 years, and it's pretty steady. When we lose that, what do people do if they've lost their television, their radio, or their newspaper? They go to social media, and we know what the quality of the content is there. Absolutely hit and miss, and more miss than hit. So these programs are really important to maintain and to experiment with. Provided the bottom line is to sustain Canadian media and not defund it.
Well put. Howard, always appreciate your insights. Thank you so much for making the time today. I really appreciate it.
Good to be back. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. That is Howard Law. You can find him at MediaPolicy.ca, and make sure you pick up his new book, Canada versus California, wherever you get your favorite books, available at Indigo and on Amazon. I want to thank Howard for joining me today. I want to thank Laura Brody for directing today's episode. And while you're here, make sure you like and subscribe to CHCH Podcast. You never missed an episode of this show or any of the other great shows we have for you, including Sportsline with Bubba O'Neill. But yesterday, it was Sportsline with Andrew Damelin and McMaster basketball coach Patrick Tatum. So go check that out. One more time, thank you for joining us from all of us here at CHCH. I'm Louie Butko. Have a great day.